Hi, everyone. How are you all doing?
Fine, thanks.
Just wave. Good to see everyone. Welcome to the American Club of Hamburg, online during COVID, of course. We've had a great series of speakers. We've had the Consul General, we've had a Minister of the Deutsche Bundestag. We had the former German Consul General to the Midwestern US states. It's been nearly every week we've had a great event. We celebrated the 90th year of Adler Planetarium in Chicago. And tonight we have a special guest friend of mine. I've known her since she was, I would say, maybe a teenager. We were together in college at the Claremont colleges. She was at Scripps College. I was at Pritzker at the time. And we've remained friends ever since. Michelle Maltais, she, after undergraduate, she went to the Columbia School of Journalism, where she did her master's. And she worked for a newspaper in New York for a while, then moved out back to Los Angeles to work for the Los Angeles Times, where she was for many years. And now she's an editor at USA Today, consumer editor. And she just popped into mind when, because we wanted to hear from somebody in the US to tell us what is going on, especially people here in Germany. Seeing the news of George Floyd, of the killing of George Floyd by the knee of a police officer, just horrific, and the ensuing protests really gaining mass in the U.S. and all of this on the back of the COVID-19, of the Corona pandemic. And we've also been watching in awe here at the mishandling from the national level, the mishandling of testing, of PPE, of taking it seriously, and of course now the U.S. is leading with cases, and there's no end in sight. So there's so much going on right now. It seems like we really have one big headline and the next one is here. And so I wanted to have Michelle chime in to just, first of all, tell us about, Michelle, if you could just share with us, give people here in Germany a sense of what the mood is like now in the U.S. and a bit of status of the current situation is changing so quickly. Michelle?
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you guys. You know, there are a variety of emotions that I've been tracking and observing across the country, this vast country, from a variety of perspectives. I think beyond the outrage, horror, and anger at everybody having seen the deaths of George Floyd captured on video at the knee of a police officer. One element that I have seen as somebody who is Black, who has lived in this country her entire life, is a sense of a difference in how people are perceiving race relations and the opportunity to make change this time. Sure, yes, absolutely, there has been anger. But I think for the first time in my lifetime, there is a number of people have been galvanized by the images of Mr. Floyd's death and the understanding of the experience of African Americans and Black people in America, just generally. Whereas prior to this, we've seen a number of cases captured on camera. I was recalling the other day in 2016 when there were, it seemed, a spate of killings at the hands of police that were captured by video. And both the emotions as a Black person in America and as a journalist covering these, having to watch them, not being able, if I wanted to turn away, And the difference is, I think, in terms of journalism, at the table, the people who are making the decisions about coverage aren't just covering a story. There's an investment in it as well. And this is one thing that my kids are growing up seeing. You know, their friends are out protesting. Their white friends at school, their Asian friends, their friends across the gamut. It's not just impacting in visceral ways the people who are reflected in the face of the person at the knee of the police officer.
Yeah, that's true. That's something I've also really noticed when they've shown the crowds across all 50 states. There are a lot of white people in the crowds, and seems like it's really galvanized a sense from the general population to get out there and do something about this finally. Of course, we saw what happened in the
David,
60s. Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. From a personal perspective, I'm biracial. So my father was white. My mother was a Black Jamaican. She became a naturalized American and spent more time in the U.S. than in Jamaica. She experienced the racism in the South of the 50s and 60s. I grew up in the Palm Springs area. I hadn't even realized that until I became a journalist, that California had experienced, deep elements of racism and discrimination. It's not necessarily something that's taught in our school books. But now in this period, I've met some of my white relatives, my father's relatives, who not intentionally may have dismissed some of the depths of discrimination that has been pervasive in this country earlier in our relationship on Facebook, because that's how we interact primarily. Now, this moment, my 60, 70-year-old cousin got up in her very rural town in New York, and she protested. She got up, she carried a sign because it has been that kind of galvanizing. So
Yeah.
that to me, generally speaking, as journalists, we tend to try to be a bit neutral, removed somewhat. It's very difficult when it's matters of identity, whether it's racial identity or gender identity, to separate those things when you are feeling perhaps the weight of attack, perhaps. And I have to say that, I'm not allowed to protest. That's not something that I can do, but I also didn't want my children to miss this moment, because this is a historic moment. So we drove by a number of the protests where his school friends would be. And I was personally moved to tears in ways I hadn't really expected to be. Just that not only were we finally believed that this is an issue, but that it's not just our issue. So we're seeing this across the country, but it's not universal. I mean, there are still people who don't necessarily see systemic racism. In fact, someone from the Trump administration, the economic advisor, has stated he doesn't believe there is such a thing as systemic racism. Which is an interesting disconnect.
This now, would you describe this? What's going on? Is this just a moment, or is this an actual movement? Will this lead to serious systemic changes?
That is the question. Honestly, we're seeing a number of companies very quickly jumping to say what they would not have said previously. This motto of Black Lives Matter. That it's become less of a motto and more of a statement of support and recognition that that it is an imperative to say we value your life. Your life is important. The question is whether it is a trend. A number of companies have donated large sums of money, but are they actually doing the hiring? Right? It's one thing to be able to say yes, 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 we support this, and to put money behind it, but another thing to show an actual commitment. And I think a lot of people who are watching, whether it's a moment or a movement, are waiting to see if they actually, companies like Apple, a lot of it, my coverage area is tech, so I have a lot of focus in that. So companies like Facebook, Apple, that have been under scrutiny for not putting their money where their mouth is in terms of diversity and hiring people of color, or elevating people of color as readily as they claim to support doing. It'll be interesting to see. It's too soon to tell. And this movement is also gaining traction within the world of journalism. Yesterday, my notifications on Twitter were totally blowing up. My previous employer, Los Angeles Times, is among the many newspapers now with staff, editorial staff, lifting their voices and saying, "Hey, we're covering this, but we're not paid. We don't have representation." In particular, yesterday, Los Angeles Times had a campaign of the employees, the Black Caucus, I think, of their union, to highlight the lack of hiring. There's one black Metro reporter in all of the Los Angeles Times. And the city and county are much, 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 much more diverse than that. So you're seeing the Washington Post, New York Times, and a number of papers across the country, a number of newsrooms across the country also reflecting or being forced to reflect on their own diversity within their newsrooms.
Yeah. Well, we just watched in wonder here. We've also had large protests here. In Hamburg, there were about 4,500 people out just a week ago protesting in front of the US Consulate. Ironic that our Consul General is African American, so here you had the case of mostly white people outside protesting an African American Consul General for Black Lives Matter. But it's just touched people all over the world. Just to switch for a moment to COVID. We see the numbers that are ticking up again. California, it seemed that Gavin Newsom, the governor, handled it very well. But now there's
debate here about among the people here whether that's so. But yes.
How does it look like it's trending now in California? What do you think? Where do you think this is headed? Is it headed towards the second wave, or is the first wave, or is it just a continuation of just the first wave?
It appears to be a continuation of the first wave. I was just looking at numbers from one of the news outlets here, and there's been no downward trend, particularly in Los Angeles County. The numbers just continue to trend upward, and dramatically so in the last month. Obviously, in a section of Southern California called Orange County, which tends to be a little more conservative politically than other parts of the state, which is generally more liberal. There have been protests about wearing face masks. Then add to it the protests for Black Lives Matter. You've had a lot of people out interacting. And I think the latest word from the County of Los Angeles is just assume that anybody you meet, if you encounter people in Los Angeles County, you're encountering people who are COVID positive, which has led to some interesting discussions about what's going to happen as well for the school year. This is one of the things that I'm particularly consumed with my two kids as well. How are we going to engage with each other how are we going to have a school year? What is school going to look like? And stores continue to reopen here, and cases continue to go up.
Well, we've seen the only large gatherings worldwide have been, of course, by the US president in his rallies that he's just held this past week. Are there any
and I believe there's one today in Arizona.
He's in Yuma, right? Or is he still there? Or was that yesterday?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
yes, the days are blending.
Yeah, but nothing talked about coming up to Los Angeles at this point.
I don't believe so. If he did come to California, he would likely go to the Orange County area, or an area where he has a stronghold of voters, registered voters.
And how is how is the mood of people now? Is there, I mean, we see the large numbers of protesters, and then there are people that are, now that they're talking about defunding police departments, I would imagine, are there opposition protesters? Are these groups coming together, or is it mostly protesters from for just one side?
Well, it appears that there are so many different factors that have been reported here in terms of the feelings, right? So I mentioned that there had been protesters against the face mask, right? So they seem to have been getting some traction with people who had previously been anti-vaccination, also called anti-vaxxers here. So those two groups have tended to support each other in this moment, and are building on that. Then you have there's just so many different nuances here, right? You've got folks who don't necessarily denounce the notion that the lives of Black people matter, but they won't use those words together. They won't say Black Lives Matter, but who also support wholeheartedly police officers. You know, there are a lot of conflicted minds, you know, about that. There is that movement of defunding the police, and what I've observed, there may be some disconnect as well about what that means. What's his name? Trevor Noah did a fine piece of I think it was Trevor Noah, maybe it was one of the Seth Meyers or one of the other late night comics, oddly enough. A lot of wisdom is coming from our comics these days. So one of them did a breakdown of John Oliver on what the movement of defunding the police means shifting, I believe. There's a variety, right? So there's some people who really push for even doing away with police officers altogether, and rising something up from the community. To another gradation is shifting some money from police officers doing a lot of the community work that they do to another entity. I know Los Angeles has done some funding shifting already, and they're in the midst of working out, exactly how that'll work out, what that means and what that looks like. But you have people who feel strongly, who come from certain, perhaps older generations, I'm observing, but it's not exclusively older generations who are connected to an identity of America, that some mottos may appeal to, this notion of America's greatness, who are dead set against the tearing down of monuments. So, in case that's unfamiliar, America has a number of monuments across the country that have been put up to Confederate figures. So Robert E. Lee, figures in the Civil War who were essentially against America, against the Union. There are some that take great umbrage at the celebration of these figures as a slap in the face to their existence. There are others who celebrate them and think they're an essential part of celebrating American history. And so there had been a movement ahead of this to take down some of these monuments, which that, in addition to the Confederate flag, signal for some communities here racism, a notion of white superiority in this country. So it's a long-winded way of saying there are so many nuances, layered in with this pandemic, layered in with people having to stay home and feeling restless or, going a little stir crazy and feeling disconnected. It's trite to say these are unprecedented times, but I can't think of another scenario in history, in our modern history, in my mother's lifetime, and certainly in my lifetime, where there have been so many different layers of important issue. Because people are also suffering economically here, right? As with other places. But you have people whose businesses are either lost or barely hanging on. These amazing layers. I always say I look forward to reading about it in history to see how it all works out. But the question you asked earlier, is it a moment or a movement?
It's early to say.
We'll have to wait and see and catch the last chapter.
Can you also explain to people here, because I've had some friends have asked me about why it's important to say Black Lives Matter. They say all lives matter, and these are mostly progressive liberal people who, if they understood, I think the meaning of the hashtag of the movement would mm-hmm. understand why saying Black Lives Matter, recognizing that is so important. Can you maybe explain to us a bit about the difference there?
The import of that people who use this phrase Black Lives Matter is that the underlying current is that Black lives don't matter in America, and it is built into the fabric of how this country works to devalue people whose skin looks like mine. And so to emphasize, yes, Black lives, in addition to everybody else's life, matters, I think is the essence behind it. Somebody put it recently, Father's Day. It's kind of not quite a parallel, but I saw this meme that said, all parents matter on Father's Day. It doesn't devalue, the argument goes, it doesn't devalue anyone else's existence to say, yes, you matter too. And I think that's the essence of that.
Thanks for explaining. Here in Germany, everyone's very aware of, the dark times of history here, Nazi nomenclature, forbidden, mm-hmm. not just forbidden in general terms, but forbidden by law. It's backed up by that. Mm-hmm. Anything swastika or is considered a hate crime, and is treated very mm-hmm. seriously. And now we see in the United States is sort of also coming to terms with brands that have offensive connotations, Aunt Jemima mm-hmm. syrup, Eskimo pies, down the line. Mm-hmm. How many brands are actually affected by this? Are actually looking to change their mm-hmm. communications, or rebranding, or redesigning their products? So
I think the primary ones that we've tracked were Aunt Jemima syrup and pancake mix, Uncle Ben's rice, the porridge, cream of wheat, and Eskimo pie were the prominent ones. And that is a question that we've fielded is why does pancake mix matter? And on its surface, if it doesn't affect you, it probably feels like it doesn't matter. But in fact, one of my former professors weighed in on this. She's a history professor, Rita Roberts, at the Communique College. With the history of the images of these products and why those images were chosen, you don't really erase that history and that impact. There was a mammy figure which calls back on a caricature of Black women, maternal, grinning, and it is taken, felt, experienced as offensive to reduce Black woman's existence to this caricature that was used to make, to appease white Americans, and in this case to sell products. She said, the professor said, it re-emphasized this notion of Black servitude, and this is woven into the fabric of how Americans have interacted over generations. I think and we wrote a story explaining the details. My team, the consumer team at USA Today. It was there was this element. It was said to one of the professors, one of the experts said that the image of a grinning Black person, a happy servant, reinforced these notions of Black servitude. And also, as a former president, and I can't recall his name, a former president of America said, you give white Americans, low-income white Americans, someone to feel superior to, and you can take all their money. You can, they'll do anything for you. And so, for many in America, that was Black Americans or Black people in this country. So it wasn't exclusive to Americans, but Black people in this country. And so those images, however sanitized, however processed Aunt Jemima's hair is, they still hearken to that visceral response. And, if I'm called Aunt Jemima by someone, it is not a compliment. It's not taken as one, it's not meant as one. So that has not been erased by however many iterations of a modernized Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben. Does that make sense?
Yes. I just want to go on to one more serious topic before I open up to questions here. If anybody has a question, just write me in the chat so I know to call on you, okay? If everybody knows how to use the chat function there, just you can write it to everybody or to me privately, it doesn't matter, as long as I get to see it. We have, of course, the elections coming up. What is November 3rd this year? Big day, much anticipated. Many of us were shocked the last election day, so we're all just heavily anticipating this day. How do you? So much seems to happen in such a short amount of time. It almost seems analogous to disruption in technologies. It's just we have disruptive events, things that happen so quickly now. We're still several months out. It's hard to believe that that what we know right now, COVID, protests, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, are going to be even the last of the big events. How do you see the next few months leading up to the elections, and how do you see the possible outcome of this?
I try to stay away from prognosticating such things. I found my previous job was as deputy director of social media at the LA Times, and so I was monitoring a lot of the comments. And at that point, if we had actually paid attention to the comments, we would have known that Donald Trump was going to win, just based on how animated his following has been. I dare not say what is likely to happen. You know, this is a campaign unlike any other, with the Democratic nominee or presumptive nominee in a basement for most of the election, the campaigning cycle, and most people locked down for much of it. With now there are rallies happening for the president with a rider on them saying, you know, if you come, you won't sue us. These are unprecedented times, and I dare not, aside from my job constraining me from saying such things, but one can never even begin to predict what's happening. You look at polling and it says one thing, but you know, there's a lot of time between now and November, and who knows what 2020 will bring to us next.
Yes. Well, thank you. So anybody on the call, does anyone have a question for Michelle? I think I saw you raising your hand, AJ. You have to mute yourself. I'll unmute you.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hi.
In this, I had a small question to my skeptic. In this acute period, what's going on right now, this epidemic worldwide, what the government of USA is taking initiative for the commercial flight? Likely I came to know there are no commercial flights as yet to and from USA. And what about those who are still stranded in different part of the world and still unable to come back to USA? Likely there are plenty of Indians still hanging on in India. So what the government is taking initiative in this regard?
So what do we see as the trend towards being able to fly again?
Yes.
And be
Was that the
repatriated.
question? Yeah.
They're unable to come
It's
because
hard
there are
to
no
say.
commercial flights, and that is only the rescued flights. There are once a week or twice a week the flights are coming to Germany, going to US and like that. And only yesterday I got the news that Mr. Trump has cancelled all commercial flights are still not there, not as yet.
Right.
Neither from India nor from US or whatever.
This is a very challenging
curiosity.
period, right? I mean, you've got countries individually setting who can come in and out, right? I believe some European countries have recently begun talking as well. I have some friends who are stuck, Florida. They're stuck in Canada. They had been stuck in Canada, unable to fly back. Now they're able, for months. Now they're able to come back. And then the airlines themselves are doing a lot to try to entice people to at least fly domestically. But based on the way we're seeing numbers trend, it's hard to imagine at this point loosening any constraints. It is a very challenging time. You're right.
Thank you. Just while we're waiting for some other questions, tell us what you're currently working on at your job.
Well, my team focuses on consumer stories, so retail, what stores are loosening their hours, restoring their hours, and what efforts they're going to make things clean. One series that I was really very proud of that we recently published was the story of the essential workers. One thing that hit me as I sat holed up in my own home trying to keep my family safe was that we were readily sending other people out to do those things that we were too afraid or told it was too dangerous to do, like shop for our own food. And so, or process meat. So we told the stories of essential workers in what we called America's food chain, from the farm to the table. And that was essential. That was a work that I was very, very proud of. To be able to acknowledge that, while we're sitting here feeling, while we're sitting here in our homes trying to remain safe and keep our children, our families fed at the same time, there are people who are putting their lives on the line, literally, to pick an orange, to process some pork, to farm for oysters, to, go shopping for you, to be able to feed their families, and they're no less concerned about their own safety.
Thank you.
So I was happy to be able to tell that story.
Annalie, I see you have a question.
Yes. So I was wondering, I noticed in Hamburg, as you mentioned, David, we've had a lot of people protesting for the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very interesting and really cool to see that it's, getting so far out into the world. I was wondering how much of that actually reaches back to the US and what sort of impact it's having, if any at all, on the movement back on the home front, so to speak.
Well, it certainly seems to empower. It feels, I can tell you how it feels. Having the world behind you is not a bad feeling. And it certainly has given strength to the movement here, that it is not just a handful of people causing a disruption. It's the world essentially rising up and saying, it's time for a change. That I believe has a significant influence.
And people are hearing about it in the States, at what's going on around the world?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And taking heart and feeling inspired in some regards. Those who are inclined to feel inspired, right? Whereas there are communities that are, may not be inclined to feel anything but the opportunity to roll their eyes at this being unnecessary.
How's the coverage on Fox News? Because I've started to see a little bit more criticism towards the president on his channel. Is it really appearing as it seems here? Is there a bit of a pushback now or challenge?
Inconsistent. The few times I do check in, it's inconsistent. The message from many of the opiners on Fox tends to be consistent with the president's message, but there have been some criticism, but inconsistently so.
Okay, Talal has a question. Go ahead, Talal.
In my limited watching.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for everything you shared so far. I'm wondering if you can go back to a little bit about what you said for the companies, what their companies' responses have been. So in specific, I'm wondering about some of the technology companies that you mentioned. So we've seen a lot of things on social media, both about these technology companies stepping up and saying we support Black Lives Matter movement. But I'm wondering what sort of steps they've taken, and do you think it's more of a publicity stunt, or will it continue on in the future, like the Juneteenth celebrations that came just recently? And then on top of that, what do you think? Since you mentioned some of these workers that are necessary workers, what do you think these technology companies will do for these workers going forward as well?
This is an open question. and this is something that my team is actively covering. For me personally, the Juneteenth, everybody jumping on Juneteenth was kind of a surprise. And there was a question of whether, well, this is the next Black holiday, or whether it was a genuine backing of this acknowledgement of Black independence or the end of slavery. You know, we'll have to watch and see. And with the hiring and putting their money where their mouth is, again, it's one of those things that a lot of companies have said many of what some people are saying are the right things, and yet not followed through in any tangible way. So we'll definitely be tracking what steps they take to do more than just say you can have the day off for Juneteenth and here's some money, Black Lives Matter. So we'll have to make sure that we continue to follow that. Was there another element to that?
Yeah, and then I just wanted to follow up
also
about, you were talking necessary workers, and now there's sort of been this change to working from home, but the technology companies have been definitely behind it. I think Twitter and Google said, we won't bring people back to the office till 2021. But then what do you do with all of these other workers that are required? How do they continue to work, and what are companies doing there?
This is, again, one of those things that we're tracking. It could be a sea change in how technology companies work. It could have a ripple effect in terms of real estate as well. Particularly with Silicon Valley and the prices of homes in that area being, maybe pricing people out of living there. If they don't have to live there to do their job, that opens up a number of possibilities for new hires as well. In terms of the essential workers, some companies have been giving a raise. Some of those raises were at least temporary. It appears like Target out here is, I think they just recently announced on Monday a pay increase to $15 an hour for their workers. But we'll have to keep watching to see if those things that were implemented initially to keep people working and to compensate them for, sort of hazard pay to some degree, or the equivalent of hazard pay, whether those things are continued. And in terms of, working from home, my team, I manage a team from Los Angeles that is primarily in New York. So in some workplaces that has been a routine, like with the paper I work for, the newsroom I work for, we're all over the country managing all kinds of things. But that's not the case necessarily with a lot of companies. And, this has shown that it is possible. We'll have to see, again, it could cause a number of shifts in real estate, commercial real estate. Do companies really need to maintain these expensive leases to house workers that could actually be working from home and then pose them no liability in terms of trying to keep them well, or having to, to install thermometers and cleaning procedures and protocols. A lot of this is still wait and see, but it's definitely something worth watching.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for your questions, Alal. Speaking of real estate, has there been a movement in real estate prices?
This is something that my team has been watching. Interestingly enough, we're still seeing a lot of properties still moving. We had thought maybe there would be a slowdown in the real estate market, but interest rates have dropped so dramatically that it's very attractive to try to buy. Plus, we're still seeing that move. That's one of the things that we're tracking right now. In fact, we're working on a story on that now.
We'll go to Kimberly. Kimberly, you have a question?
Hello. Yes, I
Hi.
do. Hi, Michelle. Thanks for all your
Hi.
insights. I have a question regarding going back to Black Lives Matter and all the things that are going on there right now. What do you think needs to be done for these protests, for these what we have as a moment maybe right now, to actually lead to sustainable changes? You know, what could we do for having, like, you know, working on social economic changes and on all those different levels to really see a possibility for overcoming all these inequalities?
It's got to be more than people on the streets, you know, obviously. And it's exhausting, right? So it'll be interesting to see if the moment is carried beyond a few weeks. So sustained pressure, being vocal, and then people in positions to actually make changes, to hire, to change policies, actually doing it from the highest levels. So, you know, we'll have to see what the outcome of the election is and what the appetite for the administration that comes in next election, whether it is Trump or Biden or, I don't know, something 2020-ish happens and somebody else comes up, to see what their priorities are. That will be very, very telling. With the past election, I was hearing anecdotally from friends in the energy sector, for instance, clean energy sector, the dramatic shift, just almost overnight, in the appetite for clean energy technologies and commitments when the election happened and Trump was elected. So, you know, the election is going to determine a lot of things. And then the stamina of the people who are speaking up.
I think it's really important that we try and find ways to make this sustainable and not just take to the streets.
Yeah.
I've been to demonstrations here in Hamburg as well. I mean, obviously, being so far away, there's not that much you can do. But if we don't find ways for this systemic problems, and then things are just going to keep going on that way. Yeah.
Yes, and you know, yes, it has. With particularly with the group, the Black Lives Matter group, that came sort of as this non-headed movement, they're becoming a more organized group, and that's an interesting thing to watch. Do they take the helm? Do they take, you know, do they run it? Does it move beyond the Black Lives Matter movement? And then again, really importantly, is acknowledging that there's an issue. And the only way I see, you know, speaking as a citizen, not as a journalist, but the only way I see true important shifts being made at the federal level is acknowledging there's an issue, and then having the wherewithal to address those issues. But you got to start with acknowledging it. But there are states that you know, for instance, California appears to be looking at how to implement changes in real ways.
Thank you.
We'll see how that goes.
Peter and Lisa Schwabro.
Okay. My main question is, how are the problems going to be resolved? I'm sure the government knows what the actual reasons are the United States is in right now, but for years, but so far nothing seems to be happening in order to solve these problems. I feel that Black people are human beings as we are human beings. If I see here in Germany, Black people, we have a lot of them right now, they are behaving, they are learning the language, they are speaking German fluently, there is no problem at all. Why do you have these problems in the States? Let me tell you, I worked for a photograph. I lived in the States for 20 years, and I lived in Los Angeles, and I worked for a big photographic company in the professional field, selling color paper where they print your pictures on. And one of my customers was the sheriff's department in Los Angeles. And one day when I visited the sheriff's department and I saw these color prints on endless paper running through the processing machines, all the pictures on there were mugshots, all right. But 90% of the mugshots were all black people. I beg you. Yeah. So, but nothing is happening. Look how the taxes are.
Peter, let's give a chance for Michelle to answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Michelle's answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. You know, the history of racism and discrimination in this country is centuries deep. And it is woven into the fabric of how we function here. And so there is a lot of, it does take, it will take a lot. It'll take a lot more than marching in the streets. That is a start. That's a start of acknowledging and embracing, because it goes beyond just acknowledging, right? That it is that racism, that institutional racism, you know, is more than just my problem, right? It's not just my issue to solve. And I think up until now, up until this moment, you know, we've had, this is an oversimplification, because there have been allies in the effort to dismantle systemic racism. But I think as we've been talking, this moment, with all of the layers of odd things happening in 2020, has highlighted this opportunity to reflect, not just reflect, but reform, revisit, remake this country. And, you know, there's a fine piece of work, a documentary called 13, that I would recommend watching in terms of how the legacy of slavery has been carried through the penal system as well, the jail system, the prison system, as a way to understand what has been happening, and perhaps why there were so many images that you saw, you know, of Black people as of the mugshots of Black people. It is baked into our society, and if I had the answer, I would be exceptionally wealthy and very happy to offer it up. But I you know, it is something that is going to take, you know, not just me in my home, but, you know, them in their home, and them in their home, and them outside of their homes doing something about it.
Okay, we've had you on quite a while now, Michelle. But we have one more question from Norbert. Norbert, would you like to go ahead? Sure.
Yes, thank you. Can you understand me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, I didn't know whether my microphone was working or is working. First of all, I would like to apologize for my English. I'm not a native speaker, so sometimes I have to construct sentences like engineers have to construct a technical device. There is so much.
You're speaking beautifully. I understand you very well.
Thank you very. Wait and see. There is so much to say about what's going on in the United States from a European view. It's difficult to know where to begin. Personally, I don't really have a relation with the United States, but a political relation. I'm interested and do a little work in public relations in transatlantic relationship, and of course, therefore, I know about the importance of the transatlantic, the utmost importance of the transatlantic relations. What I'm learning now is that my Hollywood view of the United States, which I have from the beginning of my childhood over decades, is wrong, of course. Things are very much different, obviously, than I thought, and many people in Europe and Germany thought in decades. It's irritating that in your country having a health insurance is an ideological matter, as if having that was the result of a communist conspiracy. That's complete nonsense. It wasn't the communists, it wasn't the socialists in Germany, it was Otto von Bismarck who tried to, who fought the socialists in the 19th century in Germany.
Norbert, please come to the question, because we have
yes,
Michelle's quite busy in LA.
I must apologize. Recently, I read a book by the American historian Jill Lepore. Perhaps you know that. It's about the history of the United States from the even from the 17th century. And she describes how the classical media vanished in the 90s, from the 90s up to now in the United States. So there is not, I don't know if this is the right word, objective media. How would you express that? You understand what I mean? That they more or less do not exist anymore, and that the so-called social media now are dominating, and that means that the different groups, ideological groups, are living in different bubbles and do not really recognize what the other groups are thinking. And now my question is, when will Americans have a chance to return to the truth? Because without truth, democracy will not exist, can't work. Is there any chance to end that? I would nearly say that civil war in American domestic politics. That's essential, in my view, for the United States, for solving the problems within the United States, and for maintaining the transatlantic relation. That is my question.
Well, I'll tell you this, anecdotally, this is a battle that goes on in my own home. And I can tell you truthfully that, you know, for those of us who do interact on platforms like Facebook, we are living in a very different world. My husband is sitting on the other side of the window from me, watching me speak without sound. He is more conservative than perhaps I am politically, and his Facebook feed is filled with voices I never get to hear and perspectives that I don't see on Facebook for the most part. And that's what I'm, feeding myself with. That's what I'm nourishing myself with daily, and that's what he's nourishing himself with. So we're living, even in the same household, in very different worlds in terms of the social media. I would argue that at least the objective media is attempting to stay alive, as I'm part of that. I've tried to remain fairly neutral, even as we've had our conversation today. But it is definitely colored now by this new way of ingesting and taking in information, which is everybody becomes a little publisher on their own. with different degrees of relationship to accuracy and big T truth. So they may be infusing a story that it is reported with objectivity, or at least with intended objectivity to varying degrees of success. Then that gets shared by somebody who infuses their own little T truth, and then further shared by their friends, or it's told from a perspective from opiners that are now granted the yoke of being news people. For instance, on MSNBC, even CNN, and Fox News, whereas before they might have simply there wasn't as much of an appetite for having a perspective and an edge, whereas now that is definitely something that many TV news viewers are expecting, and this whole notion of narrowcasting is sort of the way we do things now here in the States. And I don't know what the answer is in terms of whether that comes to an end. We will see what happens with the next election, and who has the megaphone to the country and sets the policies for how the country interacts with itself, with its own people, and with the world at large. So again, it's another stay tuned.
Michelle, I just want to thank you so much. I know taking time out of your busy day in Los Angeles. Today in Hamburg, we have Los Angeles-like weather. It's about low 80s here. Lovely day. Quite rare for
Gorgeous.
here. Not a cloud in the sky. And we also just had our last school day of the school season. So our summer vacation for the children officially begins today. So glad that you could join us
Congratulations, you guys
on
made
this
it.
so glad you could join us on this last day. We will be taking, at the American Club now, we will take a couple of weeks off hiatus. We gave up on the idea of planning something for the 4th of July. We always have a large 4th of July event, but just with due to the COVID crisis, it just seemed too many issues in planning a group event. So we're sad about that, but we will be back after the 4th, sometime in July, or with more events online. We have some interesting guests coming up. I won't spill any beans now, but please stay tuned. We look forward to seeing you all. If you would all, maybe I'll unmute you just for a moment here. You just unmute yourself so you can say hello to Michelle and thank her for taking time out of her day.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight to get to spend time with you, and thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for giving us some very interesting insights and perspectives, and just taking the time out of your day to have a transcontinental conversation with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate
Everybody,
it.
if you'd
It's
like
nice to hear that perspective.
Everybody
So
wave
thanks
to
so much.
Michelle. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.
You're my dear friend. We've known each
Thank
other,
you.
what,
Thank you
30
very
some
much
years,
for your
about 30
time.
years now. So
Yeah, yeah.
I guess we must have met when we
Almost
were
longer
about
than we
5.
haven't. Yes, absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us and giving us some insights. It's a real treat for us here to hear about. We see everything on the news. It's shocking, especially this year, and so it's great to hear some firsthand experience from somebody who's not just a resident in the U.S., but somebody who's an editor of USA Today. Michelle Maltais, thank you so much. Have a great day, and look forward to seeing you.